June 14th, 1944. 8 days after D-Day. The beaches of Normandy were secure, but the war had not moved forward. Not the way anyone expected. The Allied commanders had imagined a rapid push inland, tanks rolling through French countryside, liberating villages, racing toward Paris. Instead, the entire invasion force had ground to a halt. Not because of German armor, not because of artillery, but because of hedges. Ancient, impenetrable walls of earth and root called bocage. They were everywhere, lining every field, every road, every farm. Some were 12 feet high, others 15. Thick as fortress walls, tangled with centuries of growth. And behind everyone, German machine gunners waited. American tanks tried to climb over them. The Shermans would tilt upward, exposing their thin belly armor, and German anti-tank crews would fire a single shot. One shot, one dead tank, 5 dead men. It happened again and again. Entire platoons were pinned down for days, unable to advance more than a few hundred yards. Morale was crumbling. Casualties were mounting, and in a makeshift repair depot near the village of Colombière, a 29-year-old tank sergeant from Tennessee named Curtis Culin sat on an overturned fuel drum, staring at a piece of twisted German steel. It was scrap, debris from a destroyed roadblock. But Culin saw something else. He saw teeth. He saw a way through. And in less than 48 hours, using nothing but a welding torch, salvaged metal, and sheer desperation, he would create a device that would change the entire course of the Normandy campaign. They called it the Rhino, and it turned every Sherman tank into a battering ram, the man who wouldn't quit. Curtis G. Culin Jr. was not a career soldier. He was a cab driver. Born in 1915 in Cranford, New Jersey, he grew up during the Great Depression, the kind of kid who learned early that if something broke, you fixed it yourself because no one else would. His father ran a small garage. Curtis spent his teenage years elbow-deep in engine grease, learning to weld, cut metal, and improvise repairs with whatever was lying around. By the time he was 20, he was driving a taxi in Newark, working double shifts, saving money, dreaming of opening his own shop someday. Then the war came. Curtis enlisted in 1942, not out of patriotism, though he had that, but out of a sense of duty. He was assigned to the 2nd Armored Division, nicknamed Hell on Wheels, one of the most aggressive tank units in the U.S. Army. He wasn't a tank commander. He wasn't an officer. He was a sergeant, a crew leader, a man who kept machines running when everyone else had given up. By the time he landed in Normandy in June of 1944, Curtis had seen combat in North Africa and Sicily. He knew how tanks moved, how they broke, and more importantly, how they died. And in the hedgerows of Normandy, they were dying fast. The bocage was unlike anything the Allies had trained for. Intelligence reports had mentioned hedgerows, but no one understood what that meant. Not really. These weren't decorative garden borders. They were living fortresses. Centuries-old earthen mounds, packed with roots, stones, and brambles, topped with dense thickets of hawthorn, oak, and elm. Each field in Normandy was surrounded by them, creating a patchwork of tiny, isolated battlegrounds. For the Germans, it was a dream. They could hide behind every hedge, set up machine gun nests, plant mines, and wait. For the Americans, it was a nightmare. Tanks couldn't go around the hedges. There were too many. They couldn't blast through them. Explosives barely scratched the surface, and they couldn't climb over them, not without dying. Curtis watched it happen. He watched Shermans tilt upward, treads spinning uselessly in the air, belly armor exposed. He watched German Panzerfausts, handheld anti-tank rockets, streak across fields and punch through the thin steel like paper. He watched crews burn. He watched friends die. And he couldn't accept it. Not because he was braver than anyone else, but because he was a mechanic. And to a mechanic, every problem has a solution. You just have to find it. The killing fields of bocage. By mid-June, the hedgerows had become a graveyard. The 2nd Armored Division, once known for its speed and aggression, was crawling forward at a snail's pace. Some days they advanced less than a mile. Other days they didn't move at all. The Germans had turned every field into a fortress. They dug foxholes into the base of the hedges, invisible from the road. They strung barbed wire through the brambles. They planted teller mines in the dirt paths between fields. And they waited. When American infantry tried to advance, German machine guns opened up from 3 sides at once. When tanks tried to support them, they became sitting ducks. The standard tactic was to use explosives. Engineers would plant charges at the base of a hedge, blow a hole, and hope the tank could push through before the Germans counterattacked. But it was slow, dangerous, and it didn't work half the time. The hedges were too thick, the roots too deep. Even when a hole was blown, the debris often blocked the path, and tanks would get stuck, engines roaring, treads churning mud, while German gunners took aim. Some crews tried ramming the hedges at full speed. The result was always the same. The Sherman would hit the earthen wall, tilt upward, and expose its underside. 1 shot, 1 kill. Curtis saw it happen to a tank in his own platoon. A Sherman commanded by a lieutenant from Ohio. A good man, careful, experienced. He tried to push through a hedge near the village of Saint-Jean-de-Day. The tank climbed the mound, treads clawing for grip, and for a moment it looked like it might work. Then the Panzerfaust hit. The explosion tore through the belly armor, igniting the ammunition stored inside. The turret blew off. Flames poured from the hatches. No one got out. Curtis stood 50 yards away, watching the smoke rise, and something inside him snapped. Not anger, not fear, just a cold, hard certainty. This has to stop. That night, back at the repair depot, Curtis couldn't sleep. He sat outside his tent, smoking a cigarette, staring at the wreckage scattered around the camp. Burned-out tanks, blown treads, shattered armor. And then he saw it. A piece of German steel. Part of a roadblock the engineers had demolished earlier that day. It was twisted, jagged, shaped like a claw. Curtis picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and thought about the hedges. About how they were built. About how they held together. And about how maybe you didn't need to go over them. Maybe you just needed to cut through them, the impossible problem. The bocage of Normandy had been there for centuries. Some of the hedgerows dated back to Roman times. They were built by farmers, generation after generation, piling earth and stone to mark property boundaries and keep livestock contained. Over hundreds of years, the mounds had become dense with roots. Oak trees grew from them. Hawthorn bushes tangled into impenetrable thickets. The earth itself had compacted into something harder than concrete. When the Allies landed on D-Day, June 6, 1944, they had trained for beach assaults. They had trained for urban combat. They had trained for open tank warfare across the plains of France. But no one had trained for the bocage. The intelligence reports had mentioned hedgerows, but the descriptions were vague. Fields bordered by earthen banks and vegetation. It sounded harmless, quaint even, like something out of a storybook. The reality was a nightmare. Each field in Normandy was a tiny fortress, surrounded on all sides by hedgerows that were 10 to 15 feet high and just as thick. The fields themselves were small, often no more than 100 yards across, and between each field was a sunken lane, a narrow dirt road that ran between the hedges, creating a maze of kill zones. The Germans understood the terrain. They had been in Normandy for 4 years, preparing defenses. They knew every field, every lane, every hedge. They positioned machine gun nests at the corners of fields, with overlapping fields of fire. They planted mines in the lanes. They dug artillery positions on the high ground, with clear lines of sight to any tank trying to advance. And they waited. When the Americans tried to push inland, they ran straight into this nightmare. Infantry would advance across a field, only to be cut down by machine gun fire from 3 directions. Tanks would try to support them, but the moment a Sherman tried to climb a hedgerow, it would expose its belly armor. The Sherman's belly was only 1 inch thick. A single Panzerfaust round could punch through it and ignite the ammunition stored inside. The result was always the same: fire, smoke, death. By mid-June, the advance had stalled. The Allies had landed over 300,000 men on the beaches, but they were stuck in a strip of land barely 10 miles deep. Casualties were mounting. Morale was plummeting, and the commanders were desperate for a solution. The failed solutions. The Army tried everything. Engineers experimented with explosives, packing charges at the base of hedgerows and blowing holes. But the explosions were loud, giving away their position, and the debris often blocked the path. Worse, the Germans would simply reposition their machine guns to cover the new gap. Some units tried using flamethrowers to burn through the vegetation. But the hedges were too thick, too green. The flames would scorch the surface, but the roots remained intact. And the smoke gave away their position, making them easy targets. Other crews tried using bulldozer blades, mounting them on the front of tanks. But the blades were heavy, slowing the tanks down, and they didn't solve the core problem. The tank still had to climb the hedge, and when it did, it still exposed its belly. One unit even tried using grappling hooks, attaching them to the top of a hedge and pulling it down with a tank. But the roots were too deep. The tank would strain, treads spinning, and the hedge wouldn't budge. And all the while, the Germans watched and waited. They knew the Americans were struggling. They knew the hedgerows were their greatest advantage, and they exploited it ruthlessly. By the 3rd week of June, the situation was critical. The Allies were supposed to be racing across France, liberating Paris, pushing toward Germany. Instead, they were stuck in Normandy, bleeding men and machines, with no solution in sight. That's when Curtis Culin decided to act. The idea that wouldn't die. Curtis Culin wasn't the first person to think about the hedgerow problem. Commanders had been discussing it for days. Engineers had tried explosives. Infantry had tried flamethrowers. Some units even experimented with bulldozer blades mounted on the front of tanks. But nothing worked. The bulldozer blades were too heavy, too slow to install, and they didn't solve the core problem. The Sherman still had to climb the hedge, and when it did, it still exposed its belly. Curtis's idea was different. He didn't want to push through the hedge. He wanted to cut it, like a plow cutting through soil. He imagined steel prongs, sharp and angled, welded to the front of a Sherman. The tank would drive forward. The prongs would dig into the base of the hedge, and the sheer weight and power of the tank would rip through the roots and earth. No climbing, no tilting, just brute force and leverage. He sketched it out on a scrap of paper. 4 prongs, each about 5 feet long, angled slightly upward, spaced evenly across the front hull. Simple. Brutal. Effective. The next morning, Curtis showed the sketch to his crew. They looked at it. Looked at him. And one of them, a loader named Eddie, said, "You want to weld scrap metal to the front of a tank?" Curtis nodded. "Yeah." Eddie laughed. "Sarge, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." But Curtis didn't laugh. He just said, "You got a better idea?" No one did. So Curtis went to his commanding officer, a captain named James, and showed him the sketch. The captain studied it for a long moment, then handed it back. "Culin, we don't have time for experiments. We need tanks in the field, not in the shop." Curtis didn't argue. He just said, "Sir, how many tanks have we lost this week?" The captain's jaw tightened. "Too many." "Then give me 48 hours. If it doesn't work, I'll stop. But if it does..." The captain sighed. "Fine, but you're on your own. No official support, no extra men, and if you break that tank, it's on you." Curtis saluted. "Understood, sir." Scrap, sweat, and a welding torch. Curtis didn't have much to work with. The repair depot was a mess of mud, oil, and broken equipment. But it had one thing he needed. Scrap metal, lots of it, German roadblocks, destroyed beach obstacles, pieces of blown-up bunkers. All of it was piled in a corner, waiting to be hauled away. Curtis spent the next 6 hours sorting through it, looking for the right pieces. He needed steel that was thick enough to hold its shape under pressure, but not so heavy that it would slow the tank down. He found what he was looking for in a pile of German hedgehog obstacles. These were the steel beams the Germans had planted on the beaches to stop landing craft. They were strong, angled, and already cut to manageable lengths. Perfect. Curtis dragged 4 of them back to his work area, a patch of dirt next to a burned-out barn. He didn't have a proper workshop. He didn't have blueprints. He didn't even have a measuring tape. He just had a welding torch, a hacksaw, and a Sherman tank that had been pulled from the line for repairs. The tank's name was Bess. She'd taken a hit to the turret 2 days earlier, but the hull was intact. Curtis's crew helped him position the steel beams across the front of the tank, spacing them evenly. Then Curtis fired up the welding torch. The work was slow. Brutal. The torch sputtered in the damp air, the steel was thick, and every weld had to be perfect. If the prongs broke off during combat, the whole thing would be useless. Worse, it could jam the treads and disable the tank. Curtis worked through the night. His hands blistered, his eyes burned from the welding flash, his back ached from crouching in the mud. But he didn't stop. By dawn, the prongs were in place, 4 steel teeth, each about 5 feet long, angled upward at 30 degrees, welded to the front hull of the Sherman. It looked crude, ugly, like something a farmer might cobble together in a barn. Eddie stared at it. "Sarge, that looks like a Rhino." Curtis wiped the sweat from his face. "Then that's what we'll call it." The doubters and the believers. Word spread quickly through the depot. A sergeant had welded scrap metal to a tank. Some kind of crazy contraption. Most of the reactions were skeptical. One mechanic looked at the Rhino and shook his head. "That's going to rip right off the first time it hits. Something." Another said, "Even if it doesn't break, it'll slow the tank down, make it an easy target." A lieutenant from another company stopped by to look. He walked around the Sherman, studying the prongs, then turned to Curtis. "Sergeant, this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen." Curtis didn't argue. He just said, "Maybe, but it might work." The lieutenant snorted. "And if it doesn't?" Then I'll take it off and try something else. But not everyone was skeptical. Some of the tankers, the ones who had been in the hedgerows, who had seen friends die, who had felt the helplessness of being stuck in a field with nowhere to go, they looked at the Rhino differently. One tank commander, a sergeant named Miller, studied the prongs for a long time. Then he said, "You really think this will cut through a hedge?" Curtis nodded. "I think it's worth a try." Miller looked at him. "When are you testing it?" "Tomorrow morning." Miller nodded. "I'll be there." By the next morning, a small crowd had gathered. Mechanics, tankers, even a few officers. Most of them were there to watch it fail. But a few, like Miller, were there because they wanted it to work. Because they needed it to work. The first test. No one believed it would work. Not the crew, not the mechanics, not even Curtis, deep down. But he had to try. Because if it didn't work, they'd keep losing tanks. And if they kept losing tanks, they'd lose the war. The test site was a field about a mile from the depot. It was surrounded by bocage, thick hedges that hadn't been touched by the fighting yet. Perfect. Curtis climbed into the driver's seat of Bess. His crew took their positions. The engine roared to life, and the Sherman rolled forward, treads clanking, the steel prongs jutting out like tusks. A small crowd had gathered to watch. Mechanics, tankers, even a few officers. Most of them were skeptical. Some were openly mocking. $10 says it gets stuck, one of them said. 20 says the prongs snap off, another replied. Curtis ignored them. He focused on the hedge ahead. It was about 12 feet high, dense with roots and brambles, the kind of hedge that had stopped dozens of tanks before. Curtis shifted into second gear. The Sherman picked up speed. 10 miles per hour. 15. 20. The prongs hit the base of the hedge with a sound like thunder. The entire tank shuddered. For a moment, nothing happened. The hedge held. The prongs dug in, but the tank wasn't moving. Curtis's heart sank. Then slowly the roots began to tear. The earth began to crack. The Sherman pushed forward, inch by inch, the prongs ripping through centuries of growth like a knife through fabric. And then, suddenly, they were through. The tank burst out the other side of the hedge, trailing dirt and branches, and rolled into the open field beyond. The crowd erupted. Cheers, shouts, men slapping each other on the back. Curtis climbed out of the tank, his hands shaking, and stared at the hole they'd just made. It was clean, wide, big enough for another tank to follow. Eddie ran up, grinning. "Sarge, that was insane." Curtis didn't smile. He just looked at the prongs. They were bent, scratched, but intact. "It works," he said quietly. "It actually works." The moment everything changed. Sergeant Miller was the first to speak after the cheering died down. He walked up to Curtis, looked at the hole in the hedge, then back at the Rhino. "How long did that take?" Curtis checked his watch. "About 30 seconds from contact to breakthrough." Miller's eyes widened. 30 seconds. We've been stuck in some fields for 3 days. He turned to the other tankers in the crowd. "You all saw that, right? That thing just went through a hedge like it was nothing." One of the officers, a major from division headquarters, pushed through the crowd. He'd been watching from the back, arms crossed, skeptical. But now his expression had changed. "Sergeant Culin, do that again." Curtis looked at him. "Sir?" "I want to see it again. Different hedge. Make sure it wasn't a fluke." Curtis nodded. He climbed back into the tank, repositioned it, and aimed at another section of hedgerow. This one was even thicker, older, with a massive oak tree growing from the top. The crowd fell silent. Curtis gunned the engine. The Sherman surged forward. The prongs hit the hedge. The tank shuddered. And then, just like before, the roots began to tear. The earth cracked. The oak tree tilted, its roots ripping from the ground, and the Sherman burst through trailing branches and dirt. The Major stood there, staring, his mouth slightly open. Then he turned to his aide. "Get me General Bradley on the radio, now." Curtis climbed out of the tank again. His hands were still shaking. Not from fear, from adrenaline, from the realization that this might actually work. That this crude, ugly contraption might actually save lives. Miller walked up, grinning. "Sarge, you just changed the war." Word spreads like wildfire. By the next morning, every tank crew in the 2nd Armored Division had heard about the Rhino. Some called it a miracle. Others called it a game changer. A few still called it crazy. But no one could deny the results. Curtis's commanding officer, Captain James, saw the test himself. He didn't say much. He just walked around the Sherman, inspecting the prongs, running his hand along the welds. Then he turned to Curtis. "How fast can you make more of these?" Curtis thought for a moment. "If I had help, a dozen by the end of the week." The captain nodded. "You've got help, and you've got priority on all scrap metal in the depot. Get to work." Within 24 hours, Curtis had a team. Mechanics, welders, even a few infantrymen who knew their way around a torch. They worked around the clock, cutting steel, welding prongs, mounting them on every available Sherman. The design evolved. Some crews wanted longer prongs. Others wanted them angled differently. Curtis adapted, tweaking the design based on feedback, making each Rhino slightly different, tailored to the crew's needs. But the core idea remained the same. Cut through the hedge. Don't climb over it. By the end of June, over 60 Shermans in the 2nd Armored Division had been fitted with Rhino attachments, and the results were immediate. Tanks that had been stuck for days suddenly broke through hedgerows in minutes. Fields that had been death traps became open roads. The Germans, who had relied on the bocage to slow the American advance, were caught off guard. They hadn't prepared for tanks that could cut through their defenses like butter. One German officer, captured near Saint-Lô, was asked about the Rhinos. He shook his head. "We thought the hedges would stop you for weeks, maybe months, but then you came through the walls like ghosts. We couldn't stop you." The Rhino didn't just change tactics. It changed the war. The production line, the repair depot at Colombière transformed overnight. What had been a quiet backwater, a place where damaged tanks were patched up and sent back to the line, became a factory. Curtis Culin was put in charge of production. He didn't have a fancy title. He was still just a sergeant, but he had authority, and he had resources. The Army gave him everything he needed: welding equipment, cutting torches, and most importantly, scrap metal. Lots of it. The beaches of Normandy were littered with German obstacles: steel beams, concrete reinforced barriers. All of it was hauled to the depot and sorted. Curtis and his team worked 18-hour shifts. They developed a system. One team would cut the steel to length, another would shape the prongs, a third would weld them to the tanks. They could fit a Rhino to a Sherman in about 4 hours. By early July, they were producing 5 Rhinos a day, then 10, then 15. Other depots started copying the design. Word had spread across the entire Normandy front. Every division wanted Rhinos. Every tank crew wanted one. The demand was overwhelming. But Curtis didn't slow down. He trained other welders. He shared his design freely. He didn't care about credit. He just wanted to get as many rhinos into the field as possible, because every day without a rhino was another day of tanks getting stuck, another day of men dying. By the end of July, over 500 Shermans had been fitted with rhino attachments. Some estimates put the number even higher, and the impact was staggering. The generals take notice. By early July, word of the Rhino had reached the highest levels of command. General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army, personally visited the 2nd Armored Division to see the device in action. He watched a Sherman equipped with a Rhino tear through a hedgerow in less than 30 seconds. He didn't say much. He just nodded. Then he turned to his staff. "I want every tank in Normandy fitted with one of these, immediately." It was an unprecedented order. The U.S. Army didn't usually adopt field modifications so quickly. But the hedgerows had become such a critical problem that Bradley had no choice. The Rhino was the only solution that worked. Within 2 weeks, production ramped up across the entire Normandy front. Repair depots became factories. Welders worked 18-hour shifts. Scrap metal was scavenged from every available source. German beach obstacles, destroyed bunkers, even wrecked tanks. General Bradley also made another decision. He ordered that the Rhino be kept secret. The Germans couldn't know about it. Not yet. If they found out, they might adapt their tactics, find a way to counter it. So the Rhinos were fitted to tanks at night. Crews were told not to discuss them over the radio. And when tanks with Rhinos were photographed, the prongs were covered with tarps. The secrecy worked. When Operation Cobra launched on July 25th, the Germans were completely unprepared for what hit them. Operation Cobra was the breakout, the massive offensive that would finally punch through the German lines and send the Allies racing across France. It began on July 25th, 1944, with the largest aerial bombardment in history. Over 1,500 bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives on German positions near Saint-Lô. The earth shook. The sky turned black with smoke. And then the tanks rolled forward, hundreds of them, and almost all of them were equipped with Rhinos. The Germans had prepared for a tank assault. They had positioned anti-tank guns. They had dug in their infantry. They had reinforced the hedgerows. But they hadn't prepared for tanks that could cut through hedgerows like butter. The Rhino-equipped Shermans didn't slow down. They didn't stop at the hedges. They just plowed through them, one after another, creating gaps for infantry and more tanks to follow. The German defenses, which had been built around the assumption that the hedgerows would slow the American advance, collapsed. Within hours, the Americans had broken through the German lines. Within days, they had advanced 20 miles. Within weeks, they were racing across France. The Rhino had turned the tide. One German commander, interviewed after the war, said, "We could have held Normandy for months, but when your tanks started coming through the hedges, we knew it was over. There was no way to stop you." The first combat use. The first Rhino-equipped Sherman to see combat was commanded by Sergeant Miller, the same man who had watched Curtis's test and believed it would work. His tank, nicknamed Iron Horse, was fitted with a Rhino on June 28, 1944. 2 days later, Miller's platoon was ordered to advance on a German position near the village of Hauts-Vence. The approach was blocked by a series of hedgerows, the same kind that had stopped American tanks for weeks. Miller's orders were to wait for engineers to blow a hole. But Miller had other ideas. He radioed his platoon. "Follow me. We're going through." His crew looked at each other. They'd seen the test. They knew the Rhino worked. But this was different. This was combat. Real bullets. Real Germans. Miller didn't hesitate. He gunned the engine and aimed straight for the first hedgerow. The tank picked up speed. The prongs hit the hedge, and just like in the test, the roots began to tear. The Sherman burst through, and suddenly, Miller's tank was in the German rear. The Germans, who had been positioned to defend against an attack from the front, were caught completely off guard. Miller's gunner opened fire, destroying a machine gun nest. The rest of the platoon followed through the gap, and within minutes, the German position was overrun. Miller radioed back to headquarters. "Rhino works. Repeat, Rhino works. Request more units be equipped immediately." That message changed everything. Within hours, every available tank was being fitted with a Rhino. Within days, the entire front was moving forward. The cost of innovation. The Rhino saved thousands of lives. But it didn't save everyone. Even with the Rhino, the fighting in Normandy was brutal. Tanks still got hit. Crews still died. And Curtis Culin saw it all. He saw tanks he had personally fitted with Rhinos get destroyed by German anti-tank guns. He saw crews he had trained burn alive when a shell hit their ammunition. He saw friends die. And it weighed on him. One night, in late July, Curtis sat outside his tent, staring at the stars. Eddie, his loader, sat down next to him. "You okay, Sarge?" Curtis didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, "I keep thinking about the tanks we lost, the ones with Rhinos. I keep thinking, maybe if I'd made the prongs stronger or angled them differently, maybe they'd still be alive." Eddie shook his head. "Sarge, you can't think like that. You saved hundreds of lives, maybe thousands. You can't blame yourself for the ones you couldn't save." Curtis looked at him. "Can't I?" Eddie didn't have an answer. Because the truth was, Curtis was right. The Rhino had saved lives. But it hadn't saved everyone. And for a man like Curtis, who had built the Rhino because he couldn't stand watching his friends die, that was a hard truth to live with. The letters home. Curtis wrote to his wife regularly. Short letters, usually just a few lines. He couldn't tell her much. Censorship rules were strict. But in August of 1944, he wrote something different. "Dear Mary, I can't tell you where I am or what I've been doing. But I want you to know that I've been working on something. Something that might help end this war a little sooner. Something that might bring me home to you. I don't know if it will matter in the long run. But if it saves even one life, it was worth it. I miss you. I miss home. I miss the garage and the smell of oil and the sound of engines. But I'm doing what I can here. And I hope it's enough. Love, Curtis." That letter is now part of the collection at the National Archives. It's a small piece of paper, yellowed with age, the handwriting barely legible. But the sentiment is clear. Curtis didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a mechanic, a problem solver, a man doing his job. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. That heroism doesn't always look like charging into battle. Sometimes it looks like sitting in the mud, welding steel, refusing to give up. Sometimes it looks like a cab driver from New Jersey who saw a problem and decided to fix it. The unsung hero. Curtis Culin never sought fame. He didn't give interviews. He didn't write memoirs. He just did his job. But the Army didn't forget. In August of 1944, Curtis was awarded the Legion of Merit, one of the highest non-combat decorations in the U.S. military. The citation read, in part, "For exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services. Sergeant Culin's ingenuity and initiative in developing a device to enable tanks to penetrate hedgerows contributed materially to the success of operations in Normandy." Curtis accepted the medal quietly. He didn't make a speech. He just shook hands, saluted, and went back to work. After the war, Curtis returned to New Jersey. He went back to driving a cab. He opened a small garage, just like he'd always dreamed. He married, had kids, lived a quiet life. He rarely talked about the war. When people asked, he'd just shrug and say, "I did what needed to be done." But the Rhino lived on. It became a symbol of American ingenuity, of the ability to adapt, improvise, and overcome. Military historians still study it today, not just as a piece of equipment, but as an example of how innovation can come from anywhere, not from generals, not from engineers in labs, but from a sergeant in the mud with a welding torch and a refusal to quit. The ripple effect. The impact of the Rhino extended far beyond Normandy. After the breakout in July, Rhino-equipped tanks were used throughout the European campaign. In the forests of the Hurtgen, in the streets of Aachen, during the Battle of the Bulge. Wherever there were obstacles, the Rhino proved its worth. But the real legacy of the Rhino wasn't just tactical. It was cultural. The story of Curtis Culin and his invention became a symbol of American resourcefulness, of the idea that in a democracy, good ideas can come from anywhere, that a sergeant can be just as innovative as a general, that a cab driver can change the world. This idea, that innovation comes from the ground up, became a core part of American military doctrine. After World War II, the U.S. Army began actively encouraging field modifications and soldier-driven innovation. Programs were created to solicit ideas from enlisted personnel. Competitions were held to reward ingenuity. And the story of the Rhino was held up as the gold standard. Even today, the U.S. military's emphasis on adaptability and innovation can be traced back, in part, to Curtis Culin and his hedgerow cutter. The Rhino also had a psychological impact on the soldiers who used it. For weeks, the hedgerows had been a source of fear and frustration. They represented an enemy that couldn't be beaten, an obstacle that couldn't be overcome. But the Rhino changed that. Suddenly, the hedges weren't unbeatable. They were just another problem to be solved. And that shift in mindset, from helplessness to empowerment, was just as important as the tactical advantage the Rhino provided. Soldiers who had been pinned down for days suddenly felt like they could move forward, like they could win. And in war, morale is everything. The human cost. It's easy to talk about the Rhino in terms of tactics and strategy, to focus on the numbers, the tanks saved, the battles won, the lives preserved. But behind every statistic is a human story. A soldier who made it home because a tank could finally push through a hedge. A family that wasn't torn apart because a son, a husband, a father survived. Curtis Culin understood this. He didn't invent the Rhino for glory. He invented it because he was tired of watching his friends die. Because he couldn't stand the thought of another crew burning alive in a tank that couldn't move forward. There's a story told by one of the tankers who used a Rhino in combat. His name was Private James Kowalski from Chicago. He was a driver in the 3rd Armored Division. In September of 1944, his tank was advancing through a village in Belgium when they came to a hedgerow. Without the Rhino, they would have been stuck. Sitting ducks for German anti-tank guns. But with the Rhino, they cut through in seconds. Years later, Kowalski wrote a letter to Curtis. He said, "I never met you. I don't know what you look like, but I want you to know that because of what you built, I got to see my daughter born. I got to walk her down the aisle at her wedding. I got to hold my grandchildren. I owe you my life. And I will never forget that." Curtis never responded to that letter. But he kept it. It was found among his belongings after he died, folded carefully, tucked into a Bible. The myth and the reality. Over the years, the story of the Rhino has taken on a life of its own. Some accounts claim that Curtis Culin invented the device entirely on his own, in a single night, with no help. Others suggest that the idea was already being discussed among tank crews, and Curtis was just the first to build a working prototype. The truth, as always, is more complicated. Curtis was the driving force behind the Rhino. He designed it. He built the first prototype. He tested it. But he didn't work in a vacuum. Other soldiers contributed ideas. Mechanics helped with the welding. Officers provided support and resources. The Rhino was a collaborative effort, born out of desperation and necessity. But Curtis was the one who made it happen. He was the one who refused to accept that the hedgerows were unbeatable. He was the one who turned an idea into reality. And for that, he deserves to be remembered. Not as a lone genius, but as a leader, a catalyst, a man who saw a problem and inspired others to help him solve it. There were other hedgerow cutters developed around the same time. Some units experimented with different designs. Some used saw blades instead of prongs. Others used explosive charges mounted on the front of tanks. But the Rhino was the most effective, the most widely adopted, and the one that made the biggest impact. Because it was simple, it was brutal, and it worked, what we can learn. The story of Curtis Culin and the Rhino is more than just a piece of World War II history. It's a lesson in innovation, in leadership, in the power of refusing to accept the status quo. Curtis didn't have a degree in engineering. He didn't have access to advanced technology. He didn't have a team of experts. He just had a problem, a welding torch, and a determination to find a solution. And that's the essence of innovation. It's not about having the best resources. It's about making the most of what you have. It's about seeing a problem from a different angle. About being willing to try something new, even if everyone else thinks it's crazy. Curtis's story also reminds us that innovation can come from anywhere, from any rank, any background, any level of education. The best ideas don't always come from the top. Sometimes they come from the people on the ground, the ones facing the problem every day. And if we want to foster innovation, we need to create environments where those people feel empowered to speak up, to experiment, to take risks. Finally, Curtis's story is a reminder that heroism comes in many forms. It's not always about charging into battle. Sometimes it's about sitting in the mud, working through the night, refusing to give up. Sometimes it's about seeing a problem that everyone else has accepted as unsolvable and deciding to solve it anyway. The photograph. There's a photograph of Curtis Culin that survives from the war. It's grainy, black and white, taken sometime in July of 1944. He's standing next to a Sherman tank, hands on his hips, a slight smile on his face. The Rhino prongs are visible in the foreground, jutting out like steel teeth. He looks tired, dirty. But there's something in his eyes. Not pride, not arrogance, just quiet satisfaction. The satisfaction of a man who saw a problem and fixed it. In the decades since World War II, the Rhino has been featured in documentaries, books, and museums. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans has a full-scale replica on display. The U.S. Army Armor School at Fort Moore teaches the story of the Rhino as part of its curriculum on battlefield innovation. But Curtis Culin himself remains largely unknown. There are no statues of him, No monuments, no streets named in his honor. And maybe that's fitting, because Curtis never wanted to be remembered as a hero. He just wanted to do his job, to keep his crew alive, to win the war. And in that, he succeeded beyond measure. The final word. In the summer of 1944, the Allied invasion of Europe was on the verge of failure. Not because of German strength, not because of poor planning, but because of hedges, ancient, impenetrable walls of earth and root that turned every field in Normandy into a fortress. Thousands of soldiers were dying, hundreds of tanks were being destroyed, and no one knew how to fix it. Except for a cab driver from New Jersey named Curtis Culin. With nothing but scrap metal, a welding torch, and 48 hours, he created a device that changed the course of the war. The Rhino. A simple, brutal, effective solution to an impossible problem. It saved thousands of lives. It broke the stalemate in Normandy. It helped win the war. And it all started with one man who refused to accept that hedges were unbeatable. Curtis Culin never sought fame. He never wrote a book. He never gave speeches. He just did his job. And in doing so, he reminded us all of a simple truth, that sometimes the most important innovations come not from laboratories or boardrooms, but from the mud and the sweat, and the determination of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. So the next time you face an impossible problem, remember Curtis Culin. Remember the Rhino. And remember that sometimes all it takes is a welding torch, a refusal to quit, and the courage to try something new. Because in the end, that's what won the war. Not just the generals, not just the soldiers, but the mechanics, the welders, the cab drivers, the ordinary people who saw problems and refused to accept them, the people who built solutions with their own hands, the people who changed the world, one weld at a time. Curtis Culin died in 1963 at the age of 48 from a heart attack. He was buried with full military honors in his hometown of Cranford, New Jersey. His obituary in the local paper was short. It mentioned his service, his medal, his garage. But it didn't capture the full story. It didn't mention the thousands of lives his invention saved, the battles it won, the war it helped end. That story lived on in the memories of the men who fought in Normandy, the tankers who drove Rhino-equipped Shermans through hedgerows and lived to tell the tale. The infantrymen who followed behind, grateful that the tanks could finally move forward, and the families who got their sons, husbands, and fathers back because a cab driver from New Jersey refused to accept that hedges were unbeatable. Today, if you visit the beaches of Normandy, you can still see the hedgerows. They're still there, lining the fields, just as they were in 1944. But now they're peaceful, quiet, a reminder of a time when they were the most dangerous obstacle in the world, and a reminder of the man who figured out how to beat them, not with bombs, not with brute force, but with ingenuity, with determination, with a welding torch and a refusal to quit. That's the legacy of Curtis Culin. That's the story of the Rhino. And that's why 80 years later we still remember, not because of the device itself, but because of what it represents. The power of one person to change the world. The importance of never giving up. And the truth that sometimes the best solutions come from the most unexpected places. From a cab driver, from a sergeant, from a man in the mud with a welding torch and a dream.